So the transactional score is essentially this transaction score that we're summarizing in these various ways. It could be, customer, vendor, department, whatever you'd like. I also think to create some graphing of that is very useful, and I wanted to talk more about that now. Scattergraphs are fantastic for showing, say, the score to the value of that transaction, and that's a scattergraph. And then what you could do is kind of sample in each quadrant. So let me explain to you what that means. So in taking a look at this scattergraph, this is a transactional scoring scattergraph, so it's a little bit better to look at than the sample we're going to play with in a minute. But with that said, I find that the score is on the left. So, 20%, 30%, 40%. And you'll notice a lot of times, I rarely have scores, and, what I find is I really find that the scores go over, say, 50 or 60%. It is very rare for a particular vendor in that case to have in essence so much in score that when you're summarizing it up across all of their transactions and dividing it by the transactions that they have, it is just very, very strange for them to be in a situation where they will have that much score that would exceed, say, 50%. So what I find is that the value, though, is also interesting. And I just looking at this particular schedule, severity or risk to value, when you look at it, you really can kind of see that there are just a few people way out here that have high value and could potentially have a high score. I'm not really as concerned about them. I find that the scores that usually these large vendors, you don't have $60, $70 million frauds that just no one knows about. What I like to look back towards are the scores towards the left-hand side of this graph. So, more from the point of view of the ones that are under $1 million yet are above, say, 40%. And you can see a few here that if you can see my mouse, you can see a few here that really do highlight out and look quite alarming in a way that they're low value yet that's showing up on every report. So scattergraphs are good for this. When I say sampling by quadrant, I like to kind of stratify sample that basically look at the sample from each one of those lines that I have in there. So maybe at the 30% and up, the 20% to 30%, the 10 to 20%, etc. And in this particular case, we can be looking at a variety of suppliers in this particular case or transactions, and hundreds of thousands can be plotted ultimately on a scatter graph, and it's very easy to kind of pick out the ones that look strange. So let me continue to another summary. Another summary you might want to take a look at is the trending over time. So just looking at summarizing the score by date and taking a look by date and seeing whether or not there are certain time frames that look stranger than others. And we're going to talk about how to build these graphs in a second. But you can actually, if you see that black line kind of going upward, you can actually add a trend line and say, on average, this stuff is going up, and that's not good. You really should be going down if you're doing any sort of work in that process area and trying to improve that process area. So again, transactional scoring should be trending downward versus upward. So let me just close that for a second. I am going now into my Excel document, and I wanted to show you how we can basically create a scatter graph. This is a simple scatter graph that I've created based on, again, I think it's about 100 or so. I guess we have a few more than that. We have about 6,000 vendors, which, still probably what you have in your organization. I created this scatter graph over here, and we can kind of jump back into it by selecting data, and that shows us the data that is basically plotted out here. But let me redo this for you just so that you get an idea. I can highlight starting at cell B2 and selecting Shift End and my down arrow. I can go down to row 6639, And highlighting all of that data, I can just select Insert, Scatter, and just put a simple scatter graph. It always kind of puts the object on the page, so I'm just going to want to move that object, move that chart to, we'll just call it test scatter, and again creates that test scatter. It should look pretty much the same as that one over here that we created just before the presentation. And what this again is showing is my score and the value. And you always have one of these out here that's just very, very large and may have a pretty high score. In this case, I do, because it's sample data, we have scores that go up to like 85%, which again, don't expect that in the real world, but it's good for our presentation here. And again, looking at this, maybe I'll just blow this up a little bit more so you can see it. We do have scores that are happening at various levels, and I would then just take a look and depending on what you're looking for. I mean, you may say that this large valued error, in this case, if these are reports that are focused more on error than fraud, that might be something to focus in on. What is this large error out here, or potential error out here? Relatively high score and high value. What you then, though, normally focus in on is ones that are, say, below the 5 million and also scored rather highly. So let me just going over to another set of data that we have here, where I've summarized the invoice data, invoice date here, and we have the transaction score over here. Now, I wanted to bring into play, and this is why we're focusing on this. Hopefully I can scroll this open enough that you can actually see this. What I have is something called the score trans ratio. And what that is I have summarized by date the score that we calculated, again, from before, and my total score, actually, when you summarize all these transactions on that day, the total score is 6.8. Okay, so it's 6.8 out of 166. So in essence, if hopefully this will make sense, if every transaction showed up on every report, you would have a transaction score, and okay, so let me just summarize this over here for you. If, let's say, we had all of our scores add up to 1, which in essence is 100%. So if everyone shows up on those reports, it would be 1. So that would be the total. So I have one transaction, it shows up on 10 scoring reports. Each report has 0.1 of a score. You add them all up, that's a score of 1. And if they show up on every report, that transaction would get that score of 1. So in essence, if you had all transactions now showing up on every report, you would have a trans score of 166, and that would be over here. Now we only have 6.8, which is pretty good. What's 6.8 out of 1.66? It's 0.041. It's not too bad. Let me just highlight this and do a little percentage calculation here. So 4% isn't bad. 0.1% is even better. And you can kind of look down this score ratio. I like taking a look at the score ratio, and I find looking at a total score is nice, and it's a scary number sometimes because you can look like we'll just kind of do a data filter here and sort this from high to low just so you can see it. Well, we don't have that high of scores, I guess, but in the data you might have 9.3. This could be 95, and it's it's a scary score in relation to everybody else. But then the total transactions, might be 35,600 on that day, and therefore it really isn't that scary. So the ratio of score to transaction is more interesting and something that you may want to graph. So I wanted to show you that ratio, and then what I did was I created a score ratio by date over here. Let me just show you how to do that. Let me just scroll out a little bit so you can kind of see what I'm doing here. Get rid of my data filter. Now that I have these two fields here, the score ratio and the actual invoice date, I can actually highlight that whole set of data, and I can then say insert line chart. I'm going to do it with the little dots there, and I'm just going to put this to a new chart very quickly here, and that's my score trans ratio. And you can see there are some points where, wow, it goes up to 20% for that given day based on the number of transactions. So that is more interesting. It's on October 3rd, 2010, kind of interesting. And you know, what I've also then added to this is a trend line. So by selecting the chart tools, you have a few options up here. You have layout, you have format, but going into the layout, if I can find it, we have a trend line, and that's the linear trend line. I usually select that. And actually, this one is kind of flat or even going down. So just scrolling in a little bit here, it's actually flat or going down. I think I could even probably select that trend line and try to edit it a bit. I guess yep, there we go. So we can try to edit, oh, sorry about that. We'll just, we can try to edit that trend line. I was hoping to, but I guess we'll kind of keep it as it is for now. Maybe we'll look at my options here. Try to give it a little bit, you know, maybe a line style. I can go into that and maybe make it, you know, 2.25 so you can see it a little bit better. And now that I have that linear score trends ratio, you can see that it's going down. That's a much better thing than going up. So we'll kind of stick